of psychopath, who do you think of? Dahmer, Bundy, anyone who tries to eat a Kit Kat bar right through the middle without breaking it in half. Psychopaths come in many different shapes and sizes with different tendencies, urges, and tastes. Well, today I'm talking with the one and only Patrick Bateman from the book or movie, if you hate reading, American Psycho. American Psycho was a book released in 1991, followed by a movie in the year 2000 that follows Patrick Bateman through America in the 90s as he tries to repress psychopathic tendencies. Spoiler alert, he's not great at it. In this very lovely video, I will be attempting to analyze the fictional psychopath known as Patrick Bateman through a psychoanalytic lens. This is a very serious content warning. This book contains various extremely graphic and violent and extremely detailed scenes involving sex, torture, and death. Please keep that in mind, as there are also several slurs throughout the book, so if any of this is uncomfortable to you, please stop watching. Now, is Bateman a psychopath? Yes. Is he a serial killer? Maybe. It's debatable. Bateman talks a lot about the people he's killed, but it's also been proved that some of these people aren't actually dead. For example, Bateman confesses to murdering a man by the name of Paul Owen and several women to a man named Davis Carnes, who then tells Bateman that he's had lunch with Paul Owen twice over the span of 10 days and that Bateman wasn't, quote unquote, good enough to pick up an escort girl, let alone chop her up. Essentially, Bateman may believe that he's killed all these people, but in reality, it was all simply a figment of his imagination. This theory would also explain the more comical or unrealistic aspects of his killing, like in the movie version of American Psycho. While Bateman is taking out cash, he finds a cat by an ATM, and then that ATM proceeds to tell him to feed him the cat. Yep, feed him the cat, which is already pretty comical. But as the scene progresses, Bateman blows up a car with a pistol, and then proceeds to check his watch and walk away without a scratch on him. Now, while I may not have any personal experience in being drunk, on page 217, Bateman murders Paul Owen in his own home and claims that Owen was too drunk to register that Bateman had an axe, which frankly, I just don't believe. Throughout the book as well, Bateman blatantly threatens to kill people literally all of the time, but people never actually acknowledge the threats. Most of the time, the threats are supposedly drowned out by music. For example, on page 59, he's apparently muffled by the song Pump Up the Volume as he tells a bartender that she is, quote, a fucking ugly bitch I want to stab to death and play around with her blood. He says this quote while smiling to her, and once again, this might just be me, but I feel like you could at least catch a word or two. But again, I could be wrong. Classic signs of psychopathy include antisocial behavior, narcissism, superficial charm, impulsivity, callous or unemotional traits, lack of guilt, empathy, and fear. Bateman possesses several of these qualities, including a lack of empathy, superficial charm, narcissism, impulsivity, callous and emotional traits, and a lack of guilt. In most cases, his narcissism and superficial charm tend to go hand in hand with each other. Bateman is obsessed with looking good, being rich, and being better than everybody. Due to that constant need for superiority, he tends to trick and manipulate women into having sex with him, only for him to brutally torture and murder them afterwards. One specific example that came to mind takes place in a chapter called Girl, which begins on page 326 and ends on 329. Warning, again. This chapter includes grotesque scenes including rats, mutilation, rape, necrophilia, and cannibalism. Again, if you're not comfortable with any of this, please click off the video now. You have been warned. For context, context, Bateman meets a random girl at a bar and takes her home. They eventually start having sex, and partway through, Bateman punches her in the face, and she attempts to run away, but Bateman easily subdues her with mace and then ties her to the ground. To make matters short, since it's not entirely important, however, it does also incorporate his lack of empathy, guilt, and callous and emotional traits. Bateman uses a power drill to drill through her teeth and then shoves a habit trail up her area, which, in case you didn't know, this is a habit trail. It's the hamster tube for anybody that's curious. And then pours acid on said area in order to make the habit trail go in easier. He then lets out a rat into the habit trail as it enters her area and moves around her, inside of her. While she's still conscious, he grabs a chainsaw and then chops off her legs, and then that's when she finally dies. He then fucks her mouth 3 times, gouges her eyes out, and then cooks her body parts. I really did not enjoy explaining that, but I do believe it is one of the scenes that display by far one of the most intense psychopathy psychopathic traits. He easily persuaded the woman into his home with his charm and then impulsively punched her in the face, which ended up resulting in the previous scene that I just described. And his lack of empathy and guilt are on full display with a severe lack of emotion from the scene displayed in front of him. This scene also plays into his narcissism because Bateman saw this woman as lesser than him because he didn't even care to learn her name before he did this. So it basically gave him the incentive to do all of these terrible things to her. Most of these scenes involving death in this book tend to also be heavily associated with the act of sex. He tends to associate sex with murder or death, or murder with sex, whichever way you want to think about it. And she also makes him a sexual sadist because he clearly experiences pleasure when he tortures the women and watches them leave their bodies. Another pretty interesting fact is that when he believed he murdered Paul Owens, he didn't actually torture him. He just used an axe to chop him to pieces, and that was it. Like one hit to the head, and the man died. When it came to women, he really needed to torture them. He needed to experience the entire act of luring them in, only to torture and murder them, or else he doesn't get that same feeling of satisfaction. In the case of id, ego, or superego, psychopaths tend to have a weaker superego and a stronger id and ego. The id controls your basic impulses like, well, to put it bluntly, sex is one of them, like your libido. The superego is essentially your conscience. It makes you feel guilty or sad, etc., yada yada yada. And in between both of those is your ego, which is essentially the mediator of the two, trying to make a reasonable compromise. Bateman's superego is basically non-existent, if we're being completely honest. Most psychopaths tend to have a much lower superego, which makes them capable of performing these kinds of acts. Now, the only obvious time when Bateman felt some kind of guilt or sadness was when he killed a kid at a zoo. Bateman says that he's satisfied at first, but then he's suddenly filled with a mournful despair at how, quote, useless, how extraordinarily painless it is to take a child's life. This thing before me, small and twisted and bloody, has no real history, no worthwhile past. Nothing is really lost. End quote. It sounds more like disappointment than guilt, but I'm gonna be honest. But it still shows that he didn't actually enjoy killing the child, unlike how well, he enjoys torturing and killing these women who have supposedly lived more life than the child has. Wow, went long. I'm gonna be honest, I might have just started talking about not started talking about this and not actually answered any questions as effectively as I could have. But either way, I hope you enjoyed, or if you didn't, I hope you at least learned something. Could have been about the book, about yourself, your friend, it doesn't matter, but please have a nice day. If you have any questions about the book or just in general, feel free to leave a comment and I'll answer it to the best of my ability. Goodbye!